I asked one of our members a little while ago what she thought might be a good topic for a sermon series in the month of June. And one of the first things that came to her mind was the age of terror and the uncertainty and fear that comes along with it, and how timely it is this month. How does a Christian respond? What does a Christian do? And what does the Christian say? So here we go on this topic, beginning with Pentecost Sunday, which is today, and which we celebrate every several weeks after Easter, marking the birth of the Christian church and the breakdown of barriers that separated cultures and nationalities. All of a sudden, 2,000 years ago, you had Libyans, you had Jews, you had Cretans, and you had Arabs coming together in one room to celebrate the newfound life in Jesus Christ. Just in this one illustration, we understand the power of the Holy Spirit and the purpose of the gospel to bring people together and to not drive them apart. Pentecost pictures a world free of divisions, free of enmity, free of strife. Pentecost doesn't deny the distinctiveness of nations, but derides the disunity of the world. Pentecost presents the reader with an even greater understanding of God's portrait of the way for which he thinks things should be. Yet, as we know, humanity's track record isn't the greatest one when one considers the number of wars and conflicts and the number of lives lost due to aggression and oppression, and often the inability or the unwillingness to hammer out resolutions to differences that threaten to disrupt and dismantle peace. And we are too fully aware that tragedy and terror in our world continue, as evidenced in just the last 2 weeks with 2 ISIS attacks, one in Manchester, England, where 22 were killed, mostly young people, and more recently a terrorist attack in Western Egypt, where 28 Coptic Christians were gunned down after refusing to recite the Islamic Declaration of Faith. And now a suspected terrorist attack in London last night, leaving at least 7 dead and scores injured. We wonder where all this is headed and what's next, as one parishioner expressed to me her concern about the future. These acts of violence and terror, as we know, can crush spirits in an instant. But we as a nation have been known to have inextinguishable spirits, no matter what happens. We've proven it time after time. It doesn't just happen magically. It just doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens because there's a depth of faith in our nation's larger purpose of serving as a beacon of faith and hope for the rest of the world and as servants to one another. And we are this because many in our society and culture subscribe to the transcendent beliefs of liberty, equality, and justice. These same beliefs derived from our Creator. Our nation, over its 240-year history, has experienced and endured multiple cataclysmic events that could have crippled a lesser nation's morale and hope for its own future. This sermon series will focus on the strength and resolve of the American people, initiated, sustained, and strengthened by the Judeo-Christian ethic, and the importance of maintaining those same values so we can continue to rise and to overcome those who wish to dismantle and destroy the virtues of freedom and respect for one another's nation and religion. These virtues consistently precious and essential to Western civilization. We don't have to look any further beyond 100 years in our own country to understand the terrible toll war and terror have taken on in our life of our nation between the two world wars and the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Persian Gulf War, the global war on terror. If we go back to the very beginnings of our nation, we sadly count well over 1 million American lives lost, including the Civil War, where there are over 500,000 lives lost in battle, sometimes even between, as we know, brother and brother. And as we know, when we read and hear today about the terror that strikes without a moment's notice, we wonder if the global war on terror will ever be able to cross the finish line. We're too fully aware of the haunting spirit of the 20th century philosopher George Santayana's pessimistic words, "Only the dead have seen the end of war." So there can be a tendency to get discouraged over the prospects for peace in the state of the world today. But it is important for all of us to remember that we as a country have regularly, consistently met enormous challenges and recovered from enormous losses. There can be a tendency to think that we live in the toughest of times today, when actually it was much tougher with the world wars and the Great Depressions and the Vietnam War and the social upheaval that accompanied that particular conflict. But those same generations prevailed because of a deep, abiding faith in the principles and the future of our nation. And with that comes a spirit similar to a line from the Presbyterian Confession of 1967, which reads, "Life is a gift to be received with gratitude and a task to be pursued with courage." Now, when asked about the prospects of bringing the nation together and healing the political divisions today, former President George W. Bush, after a speech he delivered recently, said that it was important to have an understanding of history to know that our nation has made it through much tougher times and tougher events than we are experiencing today. He said that his job as president after 9/11 was far less difficult than President Lincoln's job during the Civil War. So when we are able to put things properly in their perspective, we're able to renew our faith in the future, understanding that the goodness that exists both in the Constitution of our nation and in the hearts and minds of millions of Americans, which will continue to withstand the perilous times that we face, no matter the circumstances or conditions. Stories like the former New England Patriot offensive lineman, Joe Andruzzi, who was at the finish line of the 2013 Boston Marathon when 2 explosions went off, as we know, killing 3 people and injuring scores of others. Mr. Andruzzi has a charitable foundation that helps the families of children with brain cancer pay for their treatments. After the bombing, he's right there at the finish line, he came to the rescue of an injured woman and took her to the closest place where he could find help. And downplaying his own role in coming to her aid, he demonstrated the breadth of America's goodness when he said, "Well, I appreciate the interest on hearing our perspective on today's horrific events. The spotlight should remain on the countless individuals, the first responders, the medics, the EMTs, the runners who crossed the finish line and kept on running to give blood, and the countless civilians who did whatever they could to save lives." That's where the focus should be. The goodness that exists, inspirational stories that know no generational boundaries in the history of our nation, the faith that nourishes the hope of the future. Not too long ago, I watched most of the 7th game of the National Hockey League Eastern Conference playoff game between the Ottawa Senators and the Pittsburgh Penguins, which was played in Pittsburgh. What I didn't expect to see was a very moving pre-game ceremony where both the Canadian national anthem and our own country's national anthem were sung and played back to back in the Pittsburgh Arena, with both teams standing in perfectly straight lines with their helmets off. About 37 of those players were Canadian, 19 American, 13 from a variety of European nations. It was an American display of respect for another nation, which was committed to the similar ideals of freedom, respect, justice, and peace. You know, in a world of tragedy and global terror, it is refreshing and heartening to see displays such as this. It's uplifting. It helps you become more optimistic about the future of our world. It's one of a million examples of the goodness that exists, and it's cause to give us great hope for the future. But one of the greatest examples of our nation's resiliency of faith, again, was its ability to restore itself after the ravages of the Civil War, with a doctrine that insisted on rebuilding, not revenge, forgiveness, not retribution, healing, not hurting. And it was led by probably the greatest president/theologian our country has ever known, Abraham Lincoln, of course. His second inaugural address, the embodiment and the cradle of Judeo-Christian values, which were essential to forge the nation forward at such a perilous time, and who the 19th century Herman Melville, the author of Moby Dick, described as the forgiver. President Lincoln said in his second inaugural address, you've heard these words before, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive to finish the work that we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Please watch this very brief segment from the movie Lincoln